To Sudan now, where the UN says the civil war has displaced more than 10 million people within the country's borders, and that number is rising. The US has pledged more than $300 million in an effort to head off a famine. But the UN says the money is running out. Much of the violence is taking place in the long-suffering Darfur region, where ordinary people are paying the price.
War rages in Sudan as the paramilitary rapid support forces fight the government for control of the country, a conflict that has been going on for over a year now. The contested western region of Darfur has been a major flashpoint, still scarred by a genocide that took place 20 years ago, also committed by militias. The medical charity Doctors Without Borders says the city of Al-Fasher's last functioning hospital was forced to close after RSF militants opened fire on medical staff and patients. The International Criminal Court says it's investigating possible war crimes.
The evidence my office has collected to date seems to show credible, repeated, expanding, continuous allegations of attacks against the civilian population, in particular, attacks directed against camps for internally displaced persons. It seems to show the widespread, prevalent use of rape and other forms of sexual violence.
Multiple attempts by the US to stop the fighting have failed, as both sides seem to still think they can win. Meanwhile, the UN has fallen far short of its goal in an appeal for humanitarian funds, while famine looms for more than two-thirds of the population.
Now let's bring in Mutasim Ali. He's a legal advisor at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights in Washington, D.C., and he also co-chaired the international inquiry into breaches of the Genocide Convention in Darfur. Mr. Ali, your organization says they have clear and convincing evidence that the rapid support forces are committing genocide against non-Arab groups in the Darfur region. Can you specify what kind of proof you have?
Absolutely. Thanks a lot again. And I think, as you indicated, our report clearly indicated that the rapid support forces, the paramilitary militia that involved in early 2000s genocide, again committing another genocide against the same ethnic groups in Darfur, the Masalid in West Darfur in particular. And the evidence that we have primarily relying on open source information, right, and also some of the victims' testimonies, especially those who recently fled to Adre in eastern Chad. There is like mounting evidence that clearly indicate that the RSF intended to annihilate the Masalid from their land. That it is actually the RSF now is responsible for an ongoing atrocities against other non-Arabs in North Darfur state in Al-Fasher. And so there is really substantial evidence, right, including some of the publicly available reporting, such as statements from the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, other human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, and the like. And so there's really a lot of evidence to say that the RSF has committed and is actually committing genocide with intent to annihilate non-Arab groups in Darfur.
Now, we are talking about possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. What legal action can be taken now, and by whom, in order to stop these crimes?
Well, I mean, because, there are many international crimes that are unfolding, right? Genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and other serious human rights violations. Unfortunately, in Sudan, there is no accountability mechanism that is possible to pursue, right? And so, therefore, we believe that there is a need for other regional or international accountability mechanisms. That begins by, number one, targeted sanctions against perpetrators and their enablers. As our report indicated, that there are foreign actors, including the United Arab Emirates, that involved in the they're complicit in the genocide against non-Arab Masalit in West Darfur. And so basically, we can think of the International Court of Justice, right, for complicity in the breaches of the Genocide Convention. We can also think of the ICC to issue arrest warrants for the international crimes that are committed. These crimes are within the jurisdiction of the ICC. The ICC has a mandate to investigate, and is actually investigating, as your report also indicated. And therefore, I think that's like another accountability mechanism. And then also third, we can think of a regional mechanism, perhaps the African Union. There are numerous accountability mechanisms at the regional level. It could be a special tribunal for atrocity committed in Sudan. And so, yes, these are the really very practical ways to hold perpetrators to account. But I do think that targeted human rights and anti-corruption sanctions to cut off perpetrators from the funding sources that allow for the continuation of the atrocities and war is key to halt the ongoing atrocities.
Mutasim Ali there with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much.
For more, I can now talk to Deepmala Mahla. She's the Chief Humanitarian Officer at the humanitarian agency CARE. So good to have you on the show. Your organization is in Sudan delivering humanitarian aid to civilians affected and displaced by the conflict. Can you describe what everyday life looks like there?
Everyday life in Sudan. So a country of 45 million people, more than half of which urgently need humanitarian assistance. More than 18 million people are acutely hungry. This also includes 3.6 million children who are acutely malnourished. And every passing day with this ongoing conflict, with obstructed aid and with unfunded humanitarian response, the situation only gets worse, and a lot of them are getting closer to death. Basic services, even like health, are pretty much non-existent. The system is on its knees. And let me say one thing, this conflict has created a war on women. From gender-based violence to sexual violence, displacement, eating least, not having health services, it is a war on women. Now, the daily life. Before this crisis, before this 1 year, people had hopes, dreams, aspirations, but now what we hear is about stories of despair, frustration, a feeling of abandonment. We are hearing very extreme measures like people having to resort to eating soil and even leaves. And let us mince no words. This humanitarian crisis is not because of a shortage or a climate-induced disaster or some bad harvest. All these factors have contributed, certainly, but the only reason is ongoing conflict between the parties and obstruction of humanitarian aid.
Yeah. Deepmala, you call it a war on women. There are reports, we heard it there, of the widespread use of sexual violence against internally displaced persons. Your organization, CARE, focuses on gender imbalances in conflict situations. What can be done, in your opinion, to better protect the most vulnerable from these kinds of crimes?
Absolutely. Women and girls have been facing, and continue to face the brunt of this conflict, which includes sexual violence as a weapon of war. The first thing, civilians need to be protected, and sexual violence as a weapon of war must be stopped. The commitments made under the international humanitarian law and the recently voted UN Security Council resolution must be respected by all parties to the conflict. Each of us, each single one of us, can play a role here. Of course, the parties to the conflict have it in their power to cease the hostility and let aid in. The international community can play a role in, first, by not looking away, funding this humanitarian response, supporting women-led organizations. That's what CARE does, because let's not think about women as victims. They are the first responders in a crisis. It is not about their needs. Never was, never should be. It is about their rights. They are the first responders. They are on the ground. They know the problem. They understand the context, and they have the solution. So let us come together to strengthen them and prevent this humanitarian crisis to becoming a famine situation, which probably the world has not seen in decades. As per projections, I will not be surprised if things do not change. It could even be worse than the 2011 famine, which we saw in Somalia.
That is a wake-up call from Deepmala Mahla, Chief Humanitarian Officer at CARE. Thank you so much for your time.